Which type of learning experiences are most productive? I feel like we have been avoiding this topic. Cindy and I have taken a very neutral position and offered a wide variety of examples of how students might learn through the use of technology. We have tried to be strong advocates for the different learning experiences we describe and believe our role is to provide a broad perspective, leaving to instructors and your own judgment to prioritize some learning activities over others. However, choices do have to be made. A limitation of our approach is that it ignores a controversy others feel is fundamental to the basic mission of education. We cannot resolve this controversy. Worldviews are often divided by values as well as by logic and data. However, we can at least make an effort to frame the controversy so that you can identify the arguments and recognize how different tasks might fit with one perspective or the other. There is some danger in our doing this. We offer our interpretations, which will likely not suit all advocates of a given position. The web page from which you access this material includes a reference list for anyone wanting to review primary sources. This is a complicated topic that has a long history, many nuanced positions, arguments, and counter-arguments. Even an overview presented as a lecture would take considerable time. We have decided to create a brief summary and a longer analysis. Neither can do justice to this topic, but the alternatives offer you a choice. This is the longer version. We are offering two versions to allow your instructor to assign the option that most suits the way your class is run. While others describe this controversy in different ways, our simple way of explaining the distinction is to suggest that it comes down to whether students will learn more when the teacher explains and demonstrates, or when the student explores, interprets, and figures out. Should the teacher, directly or by assigning instructional resources, explain what it is students are to know and show students how to do what we want them to be able to do, or should the teacher put students in situations in which the students must interpret what we would describe as primary resources to arrive at what they are to know and to figure out on their own how to execute desired procedures? It may be misleading to claim actual classroom experiences can be dichotomized. Perhaps it would be more accurate to suggest that learning activities fall at different points along a continuum, anchored by extremes of teacher-centered and learner-centered activities. Over the years, this continuum has been described in different ways. You may recognize some of the phrases used to represent the distinction we are describing. So, here we have direct instruction versus discovery learning, instructivism versus constructivism, and minimal guidance versus expert guidance. Some may argue that these representations do not mean the same thing. Clearly, consistent terminology is an issue when attempting to describe this controversy. However, our intent here is to identify terms you may recognize and that some scholars heavily invested in supporting one position or the other have used in the past. Now back to the distinction between expert guidance and minimal guidance. You are likely quite familiar with activities that represent expert guidance. Lecture presentations and textbook reading assignments are frequent learning activities for college students. The format is really not the issue. Rather, there is a focus on clear identification of what is to be understood or what skills are to be mastered, and an attempt to develop this knowledge or these skills through explanation and demonstration. The format may involve face-to-face interaction or written, video, or computer-based materials. Minimally guided learning experience immerse students in an information-rich environment with the expectation that students meet a learning goal or solve a problem. I like to use the phrase primary source to explain what I mean by an information-rich environment. because it can be contrasted with the secondary source focus of direct instruction. So, for example, a historian might work with primary sources such as diaries, photographs, and official documents in writing an account of a historical event. The account would be a secondary source and could even be a textbook. If you are a student studying history, you might be asked to read the textbook. The secondary source represented expert guidance, or you might examine a small subset of the same primary sources and develop your own summary. Different disciplines have different types of primary source content. The issue is whether you as a student work with these data or whether you focus on an expert's interpretation of these data. Various phrases have been used to describe the minimally guided approach. The following list was taken from one of the reviews we cite that happened to be critical of minimal guidance and included this list to differentiate approaches from direct instruction. You may have heard of discovery learning, problem-based learning, project-based learning, inquiry learning, experiential learning, constructivist learning. We would probably add educational games to this list. Rather than debate a controversy hoping to come to some conclusion through force of logic, those taking a more scientific perspective suggest a research-based approach. Does the minimally guided or the expert-guided approach result in more effective learning? As you might expect, there have been hundreds of studies over the years. There have been attempts to summarize this literature. You can probably get a sense of the conclusions if I read you the titles of the most frequently cited papers summarizing this research. Meyer's 2004 title reads, "Should there be a 3 strikes rule against pure discovery?" The reference to 3 strikes argues that there seems to be a kind of historical trend in which an idea emerges but is then discredited and then reemerges again. Kirshner and colleagues' 2006 title reads, "Why Minimal Guidance During Instruction Does Not Work, an Analysis of the Failure of Constructivist, Discovery, Problem-Based, Experiential, and Inquiry-Based Teaching." I assume you get the idea. In addition, those completing these reviews argue that some portion of those studies reaching more optimistic conclusions regarding minimally guided approaches are based on poorly designed research. For example, an experiment may not have compared treatments allowing the same amount of time for learning, or may not have compared minimally guided learning with a reasonable effort at direct instruction. What factors are offered to explain the advantage of direct instruction? As we understand the explanation that is most frequently cited, minimally guided learning activities have 2 main limitations. The first concerns the limitation of the cognitive architecture of long-term memory. Our existing knowledge influences how we understand new information. Learners with limited experience and background in a given area have not developed the well-organized and accurate models of the world that allow them to accurately interpret new experiences. When unguided, this lack of background makes it difficult to identify what might be relevant and increases the difficulty of interpreting the information learners are trying to understand. Second factor is cognitive load. The issue of inadequate background is a limitation of long-term memory. The second limitation, cognitive load, is an issue of what is typically described as working or short-term memory. Simply put, at any point in time, we can only deal with so much. Our consciousness has a limited capacity. Unnecessary complexity may overload processing capacity to the point that the learner is simply confused. Why not simply explain to a learner with a limited background what they should know? We add one additional limitation. While the interconnected limitations of the cognitive architecture of the novice and the cognitive load generated by unfamiliar tasks represent the explanation of the researchers we cite, we want to identify one additional potential issue. School time is limited. In our writing, we suggest that teachers must consider the efficiency of learning tasks in order to make the best use of the time available. When students explore in an open information environment, the process of learning will simply take more time. This would not be such a long-standing controversy if there were not two strong opinions on what learning experiences are best for students. The following is my attempt to summarize some of the arguments advanced by those favoring less guidance. One argument suggests that direct instruction, and the research reported in most studies, is focused on content knowledge. Learning experiences that involve minimally guided instruction place students in the position of having to take more responsibility for their learning, and they likely develop what might be described as inquiry skills in doing this. The development of inquiry and other higher order skills are what 21st century learners should be developing. They are doing it wrong, perhaps alternatively described as, who says the strategy we propose is minimally guided? This argument rejects that all of the forms lumped together as minimally guided are really that similar. For example, problem-based learning can involve a direct instruction component. The sequence of experiences in this case involves initial exposure to an authentic problem and some problem-related speculation. This activity, which is intended to activate existing knowledge and provide a purpose for learning, is followed by a condensed form of direct instruction. After exposure to this new information, learners again attempt to generate a solution for the problem. So this design does include some component of direct instruction. An attribute of many learner-centered activities is that the learner is asked to work on an authentic task. An authentic task might be thought of as what practitioners of a discipline do. Historians do history, biologists do science, writers communicate and explain, etc. Obviously, such tasks must be scaled to the background and capabilities of the learner, but the general idea is to learn within a context in which new knowledge and skill is to be applied. What makes what we learn useful? An important characteristic of useful stored knowledge is that we think of it when it might be applied. The proposed advantage of participation in tasks that require the use of knowledge is that the application provides a context for the information or skill. Knowledge and skills are not simply stored in long-term memory, but stored connected to at least one scenario of application. The contextualization or connection of knowledge with a context supposedly increases the probability that a learner will have access to what they have learned when it eventually might be useful. Overlap between the situation of application and the stored scenario can serve to activate what has been learned previously. So, it is not always whether knowledge and skills are learned, but whether what has been learned will be available when circumstances require. Does the method of instruction offer a reason to be interested? In some cases, motivation may be an attribute of the learner. Motivation can also be a product of the interaction between the learner and the task. The claim here is that the efficient, direct model of instruction can be, quite frankly, boring. The argument is that offering learners some level of control in selecting the task and the activities of learning can determine whether the learner is willing to do the necessary mental work. The idea is that self-directed learning is more likely to be motivating. What might we take from all of this? It seems apparent that we must be careful not to overload students and leave them floundering. What seems at issue is how much support or scaffolding makes the most sense. While the general trend in the research appears to favor direct instruction, There are quality studies that point to advantages of carefully scaffolded inquiry tasks. These tasks do not ignore the benefits of direct instruction, but use problems to activate existing knowledge, and following a brief and focused problem-related presentation allow learners to use this new information to struggle to identify problem solution. There seems to be unique benefits when the evaluation of understanding is delayed and when there is a focus on the transfer of understanding to related but novel situations. We list several studies fitting this description on the web page you used to link to this presentation. Perhaps this should not be regarded as an either-or situation. Some reformers seem bent on take no prisoners, abandon the old and in with a new approach. We see little to justify such an attitude. What makes sense to us is a combination of direct instruction with opportunities to apply this knowledge and these skills. Obviously, for this to happen, there must be a greater focus in the curriculum. Important decisions will have to be made regarding which topics will receive additional depth of attention.